Welcome to issue 37 of Language Testing Bytes. In today's issue, we're going to talk about the virtual special issue on test taker insights for language assessment policies and practices that was edited by Jin Yan. Yan, thank you very much for joining me today. Let's talk about this virtual special issue and the editorial that you have written for it. Please tell us a little bit about the topic of this virtual special issue. How did you come up with this topic and why is this topic important?
Thank you. Thank you, Russ, for your kind invitation. When I was preparing for the virtual special issue, I actually went through all the special issues and virtual special issues published in language testing, which not surprisingly have covered a wide range of topics like washback, impact, test consequences, learning-oriented assessment, use of technology, assessment literacy, and so on. But none of them has an explicit focus on test takers or test taker insights. In language testing and assessment, whichever approach we adopt or whatever questions we ask, test takers are always involved in our research, in our exploration. But as subject, as samples, as participants of our studies, they are expected to perform test tasks, to provide data for our analysis, to answer survey questions, to do verbal reports, or to be interviewed, providing data for investigation of test taker perceptions or cognitive processing. But test takers are seldom invited to discuss with us task design, scoring criteria, score reports, and so on. This is, in my view, not a deliberate ignorance or intentional negligence on the part of test developer or test provider. But the question we should ask ourselves are, why should test takers be engaged in assessment policies, practices? How can we develop a mutually beneficial partnership with our test takers? So I decided to work on this topic further in a virtual special issue for language testing.
Which studies did you include in this issue and why?
And to look for studies that engage test takers in assessment development and use, I conducted a search for articles published in language testing from 1984 till 2021 using keywords like test taker, student, learner, voices, insights, perceptions, reactions, feedback, engagement, and also face validity, and so on. The search yielded only a handful of research articles. 7 of them were chosen for this virtual special issue. So here are some slides I'd like to share with the audience about these studies. The first study by Brown was aimed at ensuring the difficulty level and improving test items and rubrics of a newly developed occupational Japanese speaking test. So test takers in this study were domain experts in occupational Japanese, and they evaluated design features of the speaking test through a post-test questionnaire survey. And the authors conclude that test taker reactions are of interest not only to researchers, but also to test developers who are concerned to ensure that the test is fair to all candidates and acceptable to all the prospective test takers. The second study, Jennings et al., explored the effect of the use of topic choice in language assessment. So test takers performed on a test called CAEL, Canadian Academic English Language Assessment, under 2 conditions. One without any choices of topics, the other choices among 5 topics. And test takers responded to a questionnaire survey. And the study reviewed subtle emotional psychological effects of topic choice. The participants were concerned with the potential topic effects. So allowing them a choice of topic could be a means of alleviating their concern. In the third study by Elder and McNamara, they investigated the impact of performance conditions on test taker perceptions of task difficulty. So test takers completed several storytelling tasks and responded to a survey of their perceptions of the speaking task difficulty. Test taker perceptions were found to be affected by many factors, individual factors, task features, and the interaction among the factors. The authors actually cautioned against over-reliance on test takers' post hoc estimates of task difficulty for test design or validation. In the next study, Huta et al., they tried to gain insights into the underlying values and consequences of a high-stakes language test. So students prepared for a test, took the test, got the results, and in the whole process, they reported their ideas, feelings, experiences through oral diary or pair or group discussions. The study shows the emotionally complex process of test taking and the variability in student identities. Test takers could take on such roles as hardworking or lazy learners, skilled or poor language users, confident or nervous test takers. In the next study by Yu 2007, he explored the power imbalance between test constructors and test takers. So test takers performed on a summarization task in order to generate scoring criteria. And some of them participated in post-test interviews. This is a powerful case for empowering test takers to participate in assessment decision-making. Test takers, however, were accustomed to the common practice of using experts as de facto authoritative assessment criteria. And they were more than happy to maintain the current practices. In Kim and Elder 2015 study, they hoped to understand test takers' views on policy-driven constructs of an aviation English test. By policy-driven, they mean that the constructs of the test were determined by ICAO's language proficiency requirements, International Civil Aviation Organization. And pilots, air traffic controllers participated in the survey, and some of them completed interviews. Test takers in this study are domain specialists with unique insights concerning what matters for effective communication. And test takers' views, according to the authors, should be reflected in the design of LSP tests and in the policies under which such tests are implemented. The last study included in this special issue by Butler et al. 2021, they hoped to understand young learners' perceptions of assessment principles and practices. So test takers or learners completed mock English tests and participated in the interviews. The study found that young learners, 4th and 6th graders, ages 9 to 12, they had already obtained deep knowledge and experience with English language assessments, and they could articulate their views, both critical and constructive, about the current English language assessment practices with which they're familiar. So these are the studies I included in this special issue. In these studies, conscientious efforts were made by the researchers to engage test takers in assessment practices, in assessment policy making. And test takers' voice played a crucial role. Explicit comments were made by the authors on the importance of engaging test takers in assessment activities. And these studies cover a time span of about 3 decades. So that's the 7 studies I included in this virtual special issue.
In your editorial, you discuss the potential benefits of incorporating test taker insights in language assessment policies and practices. Could you please briefly summarize these benefits?
The most obvious benefit of test taker engagement is their perceptions could inform task design and shed light on test validity. Test takers can bring, as we can see from the previous studies, bring a critical perspective to validation research and contribute to validity arguments. For example, studies of test takers' cognitive processing can help us understand whether test takers are processing the tasks in the way we expect them to do. That is, if the task is actually measuring what we want to measure. In an LSP context, test takers may have a stronger voice because they are likely to have relevant domain knowledge and experiences. So their voices, their views on test constructs could help us strengthen the validity, the construct validity. Test taker involvement is also beneficial to test takers' affective or emotional reactions to the test, therefore promoting washback effects. Research shows that student or learner perceptions are related to their achievement constructs like self-regulation, self-efficacy, motivation, and so on. So involvement in assessment activities may change test takers' perceptions. When they are involved in test development, tasks are likely to be perceived as more authentic or interactive. And with a more positive perception of the tasks or the tests, test takers will be highly motivated and perform better in the assessment. And finally, test taker engagement may empower test takers. When their needs and wants are understood and their insights incorporated in assessment decisions, test takers become an active stakeholder group, and the tests are likely to be considered fairer. These are the major benefits of incorporating test taker insights in assessment policies and practices.
Okay. You also mentioned that researchers and practitioners may face challenges when engaging test takers in language assessment practices activities. What are some of these main challenges?
The biggest challenge comes from the imbalanced power relationship between test maker and test taker. Whether in large-scale testing or classroom assessment, learners are seldom consulted on what should be assessed or how they should be assessed. Elena Shahami proposed to examine how tests are produced. She asked, are tests the product and creation of testers alone, or do they involve other stakeholders in a more democratic and involved process? And also there is a stereotypical perception of students' inferior status in the assessment hierarchy. For example, in Yu's study I just talked about, students were engaged in the development of assessment criteria. Students held the view that they are to be evaluated, not valued. It was found that students strongly preferred expert scoring criteria. And the researchers' intention to have students' voices heard became a kind of, using the author's word, imposed democracy on the students. Also, the practicality of implementing what we call democratic assessment strategies is a major challenge. In Jennings' study, Jennings 1999 study, topic choice was designed to give students more flexibility to decide on the topics to read. So in a sense, this could be seen as adaptive testing, adapting to the needs of learners to the test takers' interests. But few tests are doing this, not even the current version of the CAEL test. Practicality is a big challenge. The view that test takers are not sufficiently assessment literacy may also explain the absence of student voices. Their views could be dismissed as irrelevant because only professionals with expertise are believed to be able to do the job well. Butler's study rejected this assumption. They found that learners are sufficiently trained or assessment literate to articulate their thoughts and experiences with assessments. And finally, test taker perceptions could be affected by many factors. In Elder's study, they found that test takers' post hoc evaluation of task difficulty was affected by test taker characteristics, by task features, by the interaction of these among these factors. So it was suggested that test takers should be consulted at an early stage of test development if we want to know their views on task difficulty. So these are the major challenges we are facing when we hope to engage our test takers in our assessment policies and practices.
In your conclusion, you stated that the 7 articles in this virtual special issue represent 2 main strands of research. So one strand is research on test taker perceptions, experiences, and cognition for test validation, and another strand is research on test taker engagement in assessment development and score use. From the researcher's perspective, which strand do you find more challenging to pursue and why?
This is a very interesting question, and I'd like to share 2 more slides with the audience to give a brief explanation of these 2 strands. Okay. So when I was preparing or looking for articles, actually reading the articles related to test taker insights, I was subconsciously measuring the level of test taker engagement, so kind of putting them on a scale of 1 to 10. The evaluation criteria I used include purpose of the study, type of activities students are involved in, the usefulness of the data collected from test takers, degree of interaction among the test provider and test taker, or the explicitness of the comments made by the authors on test taker insights. It was, of course, almost impossible to achieve a high reliability if I had invited a colleague to double-check the rating. However, this process helps me to think about the nature of test taker engagement and the value of test taker insights. Like many things we want to measure, the degree of test taker engagement is on the continuum. Towards one end of the continuum, I call the first strand, test takers serve as sources of data, perceptions, experiences, performances, cognitive processing, and so on. And the purpose of collecting the data in this kind of research is to validate the tests. So the focus here is clearly on the test. We can say that test takers are engaged, but rather passively, in assessment development and validation. And towards the other end of the continuum, I call the second strand, test takers are engaged much more actively in assessment development and score use. For example, in use study, test takers were involved in development of scoring criteria for a summarization task. Of course, both strands, ultimately, test takers would benefit from both strands of research. But the focus of the second strand is more explicitly on test takers. In my view, active participation of test takers in decision-making, in practices, is more challenging to pursue. That is the second strand. This type of test taker engagement is what could be called democratic assessment in language testing, because it has greater potential to empower test takers. And to promote democratic assessment, as Shahami emphasized, test takers, test makers should engage in mutual constructive effort, working together to construct the meaning of knowledge. As I said in the editorial, test takers are learners of a new language, performers of tasks, users of scores. They have different characteristics, levels of self-esteem, dreams about their future. Test takers are capable of constructing knowledge. They are sensitive to their cultural, social identities and susceptible to manipulation. Test takers have the legitimate right to have their feelings deciphered and their voices heard. So that's mainly the 2 strands I talked about in the virtual special issue about studies of test taker engagement in language testing and assessment.
What advice or recommendations would you give to researchers who are interested in conducting studies that incorporate test takers' insights in language assessment policies and practices?
In my view, test taker engagement is not only necessary but mandatory and needs urgent action. The first recommendation is for test developers or test providers. In pursuit of professional standards in the psychometric tradition, test developers may have, in my view, sacrificed the humanistic aspect of language assessment. So, for example, efforts, in my view, should be made to pay conscious attention to the deeper emotional, affective aspects of test takers, such as improving their test-taking experiences, reducing anxiety, raising motivation, and so on. And secondly, for researchers, more empirical studies, especially those towards the second strand I just talked about, should be conducted to explore how test takers, including young learners, can be involved in meaningful ways in the development and use of language assessments. Of course, there are some issues here. One of them is how to conceptualize such empirical studies from the perspective of validity arguments. That is, which aspect of validity in the broadest sense of this concept, that is, including fairness, justice, or even ethics, which aspect of validity are we exploring? Scholars have already started to take into consideration stakeholder engagement in their conceptualization of test validity. For example, Shahop Devel and O'Sullivan 2020 book on test validity. They proposed an integrated validity framework, which includes an argument focusing on communication engagement. It was argued that stakeholder engagement is essential to ensure beneficial test consequences. So it is important to think of stakeholders, test takers included, as active participants in the testing program. They actually put forward a number of questions on who, what, how to design and implement communication engagement plans. And recently, IOTA, International Language Testing Association, formed a SIG, Special Interest Group, specifically for test taker insights in language assessment, TILR. So readers may take a look at IOTA's website for more information about the aims, the objectives, the activities of this SIG group.
Thank you for sharing these recommendations. Do you have any final words for our viewers regarding this topic of test taker insights for language assessment policies and practices?
Assessment is an indispensable part of education. As language testing professionals, we are facing what Professor Litz Hemplines called the ethical dilemmas. So the greatest challenge we are facing as language testing professionals is to balance society's need for assessments with our determination to do our best for our learners. When the ideology of learner-centered teaching, learning has been advocated for decades, I think it is high time that test-taker-centered assessment be advocated and implemented. It is important for us, for example, to cultivate an ethical milieu in which students would think that they are partners in assessment, and assessment is part of the learning process. So what we need at this stage is a more coherent theme and more explicit focus on incorporating test taker insights in assessment policies and practices. I hope that this call for engaging test takers in this special issue will promote more research and discussion in this area.
Jan, thank you very much for taking time to participate in this interview. I look forward to welcoming our viewers in the next issue of Language Testing Bytes.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me today, for having me today. Thank you.